Thank you. So my name is Daniel Howe. I teach at the School of Creative Media at CityU. And it's been great to see so many people out here in the last few days. Very inspiring, I think, for the future of Hong Kong. Anyhow, so my topic today is about surveillance, and specifically what we as individuals can do to protect ourselves and our sensitive communications. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about general principles and then also about the specific situation here in Hong Kong. And you can stop me as I go if you have a question, and hopefully there will also be time for questions at the end. Okay, and I think this topic has particular relevance at this moment due to the relationship between surveillance and freedom in societies, and the implications of widespread surveillance specifically for the potential of democracy. So recently, in December, on International Human Rights Day, a group of nearly 600 authors, including 5 Nobel Prize laureates from over 80 countries, published a letter in defense of civil liberties against surveillance by corporations and governments. And in their statement, they said the following: human integrity extends beyond the physical body. In their thoughts and in their personal environment and communications, all humans have the right to remain unobserved and unmolested. This fundamental human right has been rendered null and void through abuse of technological development by states and corporations for mass surveillance purposes. And they continue, a person under surveillance is no longer free. A society under surveillance is no longer a democracy. End quote. It's not a coincidence that perhaps the most influential prison design of all time, Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, was built entirely on the principles of surveillance, what he called a new mode of obtaining power of mind over mind. Or as Foucault said, it's a diagram of mechanisms of power reduced to ideal form. And this idea of power I'll come back to in a moment. So then, what is the situation here in Hong Kong as relates to surveillance? Well, the basic law, Article 30, stipulates that freedom and privacy of communications of Hong Kong residents shall be protected by law. This sounds great. There's also mention of a right to privacy in Article 14 of the Hong Kong Bill of Rights. However, there are few, if any, of these protections that have been written into subsequent law post-2006. And in 2006, the law that was passed was called the Interception of Communications and Surveillance Ordinance. And this basically gives the Hong Kong law enforcement agencies, which consist of the police, the Customs and Excise Department, the ICAC, Immigration Department, etc., broad powers to wiretap our phones, bug offices, and to monitor online communications. So this includes email, your chat, your voice chats, etc. Of course, as some of you may know or even remember, the pro-democracy lawmakers walked out of the chamber in protest of this vote. So they didn't vote. They did this after attempting to introduce nearly 200 amendments to the bill, all of which were defeated or ruled out of order. And these included attempts to limit the use of surveillance against political opponents, against lawyers, and against journalists. So, as I said, all of these were defeated, and so no such protections exist for people in Hong Kong at least in regard to the government use of surveillance on its citizens. And this was a New York Times article at the time that summarized how basically Hong Kong authorities can do whatever they want with this new law. So all this by way of saying that the legal situation in Hong Kong regarding surveillance is not good. And of course, with increasing pressure from Beijing, the alleged sponsors of the 2006 bill, it's unlikely to get better anytime soon. However, due to the hard work of Hong Kong's fan, Edward Snowden, we've learned that this is a bit of a good news, bad news joke, although maybe not a funny one. The bad news being that Hong Kong citizens have none of the protections that citizens in countries in North America and Europe enjoy. The good news is that none of these legal protections, we've also learned this from Snowden, are obeyed or enforced in those countries in the first place, so it actually doesn't matter very much. And the bottom line is that if you want to be protected against surveillance and assure the privacy of your communications online, no matter where you live, you need to do it yourself using defensive technologies, which is the topic today. So first, a few general notes about privacy and security online. The first being it's never possible to fully protect oneself. When we share things with others, there's always some risk that this information will be used in ways we didn't intend. But at the same time, sharing is an essential human activity that we do not want to give up. So thinking about protecting ourselves always involves evaluating trade-offs between the risks of sharing and the benefits. And in computer security, this is often referred to as risk assessment. And this is a topic I'm going to skip over mostly due to the short time, but something that if we did a longer workshop, we'd probably spend quite a while on, specifically figuring out what are the assets involved, the things we value, like the confidentiality of our email, as an example, or our chat messages. How might these assets be threatened? The different types of adversaries that might threaten them, for example, a government agency, a political opponent, an advertiser, or a service provider like Facebook or Google, or even an autocratic employer. And then finally, what is the likelihood or risk of these threats actually happening? So all of these elements together define what we call a threat model that is a very specific set of assets, risks, threats, and adversaries for which we can then craft a specific strategy for defending ourselves. And the point here is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to these problems. Protecting privacy is an ongoing practice, and each specific scenario or use case needs to be assessed separately. Of course, I'm about to break this rule by going over some general strategies in this talk, but it's an important idea nonetheless. My source for these past few slides is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, specifically their Surveillance Self-Defense Project, which is a great resource. I have links at the end that you can see when this talk is posted online. The only problem with this project is that it's a U.S. organization that focuses on the U.S. legal context, and it's also a bit out of date, but will hopefully be updated soon. So next we can consider the types of adversaries we may encounter when communicating online. Many of these you can probably guess, but we have cellular network providers like SmartTone or 123, online service providers like Google, Yahoo, Facebook, Instagram, etc. We have ad agencies who've been responsible for lots of the surveillance on the web so far. And then we have individuals or groups who, for whatever reason, might wish to do us harm. And so I've listed a few of the types of threats we might encounter from these adversaries if we're sharing sensitive communications online. The first threat is to anonymity. So that is people knowing who we are and linking that to our real-world identity. And so this is particularly applicable to cases with activists who are perhaps trying to publish sensitive content anonymously on a website or a blog, but also to cases where one is accessing sensitive materials, materials that might cause a repressive government or corporation to either censor or persecute that individual. And these threats to anonymity generally fall into the following four areas, each a different way of identifying you online. The first and simplest case is via login. You log into an online service like Gmail, and then that service and all of its affiliates know who you are and what you're doing on the web. Unless you are able to sign up anonymously, which is actually quite more difficult than it sounds. The second way is through cookies, which many of you may have heard about. And these are the small bits of data that your browser downloads from sites you visit. Also, their affiliates, advertisers, etc. And these can also be used to identify you. The third, and perhaps most important, is IP address. And the IP address is the unique address assigned to each computer, or in some cases to a group of computers on the internet. You can think of this like your phone number, which you give out each time you send data over the net, like visiting a web page. You include this IP address so that the web page can send its content back to you. And in many cases, this IP address uniquely identifies you, or at very least, it identifies you to your service provider, whether that's PCCW or a university or what have you. And lastly is browser fingerprinting, which is a less known but very powerful way for websites to recognize you based on the specific properties of your system. Things like the various versions of your browser, operating system, software you've installed, even the fonts you've installed. And this approach turns out to be very effective at identifying individuals and tracking them over time. So then what can we do to defend against these techniques? So first I'll start with three sort of general tips that will make everything that follows much easier. The first, which of course applies beyond anonymity, and this is to try to avoid using Windows for anything significantly private or sensitive. It is not, and actually has never been, as secure as the other operating systems that are out there. Okay? Obviously, it's not always a choice to not use Windows, but it's a good strategy when you can do it. Second, if you have to use online services, Facebook, Google, Twitter, etc., it's important that you don't stay logged into them when you browse to other sites, as these sites will be able to track your behavior across the web and then correlate it with your ID. And once stored, this information can then be traded between companies, it can be requested by government agencies, it can be sold, or even hacked or stolen. And the third tip is never to use your everyday browser, whatever that might be, Firefox, Safari, Chrome, whatever, when doing particularly sensitive things. So this might mean going to an internet cafe to write your anonymous blog, or a shared computer at school, which should help, but it might also mean using the Tor browser. I'll spend the next few minutes on this very powerful tool for preserving online anonymity called the Tor browser. And what it does is it hides your IP address, protects you from tracking by cookies, and obscures your browser fingerprint. So when you use Tor correctly to visit a website, there's almost no way to trace that visit back to you. Except in very extreme cases, Tor is a great solution for protecting yourself, protecting your anonymity. And if we have time later, I can talk about exactly how it works to solve that problem. But of course, there are negatives as well to using Tor. For one, you can't log into these online services like Google or Yahoo or Facebook. You can't view insecure content, things like Flash movies or Java applets. And it can be quite slow, up to 10 times as slow as not using it for loading web pages. There are also anonymization options like proxies and VPNs, but these generally require you to trust whoever's running that service not to do anything bad. And so in this sense, they're not nearly as safe as Tor. So Tor is great for protecting your anonymity in the case you want to publish or access sensitive materials. I'm not going to talk about accessing blocked content today, say due to the Great Firewall, as this is not a problem we have to deal with much in Hong Kong, at least for the moment. But what Tor doesn't do is protect your content once it leaves the Tor network. It hides who you are, but not what you're doing. So let's consider another use case where we have a journalist and a source who want to discuss and/or exchange sensitive material. Here, and again, it would depend on the specific circumstances, but one would generally want to use encryption to keep the contents of your messages secret and unreadable to anyone but the intended receiver, so the journalist to the source or the source to the journalist. And in this case, only one side can actually be anonymous because the journalist has to publish their info so that they can be contacted. One of the very few reassuring things we learned from the Snowden disclosures is that encryption, if done correctly, which is a rather big if, actually works. And by works, it means that if you encrypt a message, no matter how much money, how many computers, or how many guns they have, will be able to decrypt and read that private message, unless you give them the key. Now, the kind of encryption you can use will depend on the types of communication you're doing. So you have email, you have voice chat, you have files you're trying to exchange, etc. So for our example, we can look at chat. Here we can use something called off-the-record messaging, OTR, and there's a pretty simple software. There are pretty simple software tools on all the major platforms, including even Windows, that will enable you to easily encrypt your chat conversations with OTR. And so here's what that looks like when you do chat communications on Facebook or Gmail using the OTR software. So you can see that Gmail or Google and Facebook see these encrypted messages that they can't read, or they can store them, but they'll be unreadable. There are also tools for encrypting email and even for encrypting voice over IP and video conversations, but I will leave those aside for now because of the short time. So lastly, in our brief, necessarily incomplete list is something called metadata, which you may have heard of in the recent media, and refers to everything about a communication except the content of the message itself. So here's a quote from a recent New York Times article called "Surveillance: A Threat to Democracy," which says that surveillance of metadata fundamentally alters the relationships between individuals and their government. So if we imagine again this conversation between a journalist and her sources, if an adversary can access the metadata, they won't know the content of what is being discussed, but they will know who the journalist talked to, how often, when they talked, and for how long they talked. And you can see how this would be very dangerous information to leak out in certain cases. I won't go into the more complicated details of protecting metadata here, but the larger takeaway point from this quote is that when we talk about freedom and democracy, what we're really talking about is power. Who has it, who doesn't have it, and how that power manifests itself. And these days, technology, specifically surveillance technology, is one important way that power plays out in society. So we briefly considered three types of threats here. Threats to anonymity, threats to message content, and threats to metadata, which we didn't really go into, that can help protect us. And actually there are quite a range of tools available nowadays, and I've only just scratched the surface of a few popular ones. So this slide gives just an overview of some of the things I've talked about, some strategies for protecting yourself. So on the right side, don't use Windows for sensitive communications. Don't use your everyday browser for sensitive tasks. And don't stay logged into online services like Facebook and Google and Skype when you're doing other things. We can use Tor as a great tool for anonymity. We learned from Snowden that encryption actually works, and so that's a great strategy as well. So we can use off-the-record messaging for chat and IM. We need to be able to delete our files securely. So just throwing a file into the trash or the recycling bin is not enough if that's a sensitive file. You need to actually wipe that off the hard drive completely. Depending on which computer you're using, there are different ways to do that, but on the Mac, you can just right-click the trash icon and say, secure empty trash. And that will completely erase the file. And if you don't do that, then someone who knows what they're doing could come and unerase those files from your trash, even after it's been emptied. Okay. Use good password hygiene. We didn't really talk about that today, but I have a slide that I'll include on the PowerPoint that will be posted online. And don't use HTTP for sensitive tasks. Only use HTTPS. And that's an important thing, again, that I won't get into too much, but you can often see in the browser a little lock next to the address which says HTTPS when you're in a secure connection. And you should always look for that lock if you're going to enter a password or log into something. So here are some of the things I could have talked about today, but didn't, mostly due to the time constraints. So we have some other ways that surveillance might occur. Location tracking via mobile phones, which always tell the cell towers where you are when they're enabled. Tracking by advertisers and ad networks online. How to be safe using internet cafes and other shared PCs. Encrypting and exchanging sensitive files. So if the journalist and the source need to exchange documents, right? How is the best way to do that? The safest way to do that? And also things that could be installed on your computer that will give away the information, including keyloggers, which are things that send out every key you type to some adversary. And if a keylogger is on your machine, there's not much you can do because everything, every keyboard stroke you make gets sent out. So it doesn't matter if you're encrypting or you're using Tor, because that's all after it leaves your computer. So finally, and I hope to, if people are interested, to do a little tutorial after this talk. If you want, stick around. But finally, my hope is that this can be part of a continuing and more in-depth set of conversations in Hong Kong involving activists, journalists, and technologists on surveillance and self-protection in the months and even years to come. So I plan to do some monthly meetings with whoever's interested, and specific workshops, and do workshops on specific use cases. So if you came to me and said, well, you know, I'm having these conversations over voice over IP, I'm talking with someone on the internet, and I need to make sure these communications are kept secret. And then we can look at the various options and decide on what the best plan is. So if you think you might be interested in attending, these will all be free and more hands-on workshops. Please contact me. Any of the methods listed above will work. You can tell me what you're interested in doing, what you'd like to learn, or specific problems you're facing in your work or in your life otherwise. I'll also post these links to some of the technologies I talked about. The EFF at the top is a great reference for this stuff in general. We have Tor, we have off-the-record messaging, and then a few other tools that are quite useful for various situations.
Yes. 各位有冇問題想問呢？ Thank you very much for your talk, and it is very informative. And as like a normal user, I think that we should all encrypt our messages, because I know that currently only few of us know of this technology. We are all using, but we don't know how to use it wisely. And if we know that just a relatively small group of people in the internet are currently encrypting their messages, so it is relatively easy for the agents to find out and to spot out those encryption, because few people encrypt those. So I think we should do more promotion, and I think we do need more this kind of talks in depth to teach people how to securely store and encrypt all their messages, so that when all messages are encrypted, the risk of being surveillance is much lower. So I hope that we can have more of these talks and more details. Thank you.
That's a really good point. You know, the way things are now, when only a few people are using encryption, those people can actually make themselves into targets because it seems as if they're doing something suspicious even when they're not, right? So when we have more people using encryption, you're not only helping yourself, but you're helping all the other people who might be sharing sensitive information, right? So that's an excellent point, and yeah, I would love to keep doing these kind of workshops to help people do that.
Can you elaborate a bit more on why you are not recommending using Microsoft? Because that is the most popular operating system in the world, still used by most people, especially people like our age. I mean, what are the vulnerability of using Microsoft for sensitive communication? Is it on a corporate level, or is it because it is not open source, or and how does it compare to the other popular platforms like the Mac OS and the Linux? Thanks.
I think it's a fact that very few people would disagree with, that Windows is noticeably less secure than the other platforms, right? And there's one of the reasons for that, maybe because it's used more often, so therefore it's targeted more often, right? And it's not impossible to use Windows in a secure way, but it's much more difficult. So one of the tools that I put on this list is called Tails, and basically that's a whole operating system that fits on a USB drive, and so you can take it and you can plug it into a Windows machine, and then instead of using Windows, it uses this operating system, which is built from the ground up to be secure. So it will do a lot of the encryption tasks for you. It will use Tor by default when you go to browse things on the web. And then when you take out the USB stick, it automatically deletes all traces of your presence from the host computer. So, and it's free, and as I said, it fits on a tiny USB stick. So this is, depending on the situation, a much better option than trying and maybe spending a lot of time and effort to make Windows behave securely. There have just been so many exploits and vulnerabilities in Windows over the years that it's hard to imagine that it's actually secure at any point.
Because nowadays smartphones is a very common communication tools, which apps like WhatsApp, Telegram, or WeChat, what communication apps would you advise to be a secure way of communicating through these smartphones?
Okay, also good question. So on there are good apps that do encryption on mobile phones, and also apps that let you do Tor on mobile phones. So one is called Text Secure, I believe, that allows you to do text messaging from a phone that's encrypted. There's another program called Orbot, which is basically a Tor browser for your phone. The first question was about speed, yes? So encryption at this point does not add any noticeable processing time to your experience. This is not the same as Tor, which does add noticeable slowness to your browsing experience. It takes much longer to visit a page using Tor than it does without Tor. But in the case of encryption, no. Like, computers are so fast relative to how they were 10, 15, 20 years ago that it's not even noticeable.
It has been known that some of the browsers will have a private browsing mode, just like incognito mode in Google Chrome. It won't leave any browser records once you close the browser, but I'm uncertain that if there are still any known risk using the private mode in the browser.
Good question again. So what private mode or incognito mode does is basically clears the data from your local computer. So that means if you're browsing on some naughty sites and then your spouse or your girlfriend or your boyfriend comes to the computer, they won't see any evidence of this stuff. But that does not mean that the sites you are browsing or anyone snooping on the communications, they still see all the normal stuff. So it actually only helps for your local computer. And so it's actually not, for most cases, a very useful protection.
So you mentioned that protecting privacy is a trade-off. So what's the cost that we might not want again? What's the cost?
Well, it's a trade. I mean, it would be easy to be totally private and secure if you never talked to anyone and never left your house, right? So you're always, but it's natural behavior, natural human behavior. It's important to be able to share things with your, with whoever. So the trade-off is always how much you want to share, and then what the risks are in terms of that shared content either being stolen or viewed by someone else or whatever. But I mean, this applies to all types of security questions, right? I mean, crossing the street with heavy traffic is a trade-off, right? Between safety and sort of efficiency of getting where you want to go, right? So you weigh that and you say, it's very unlikely if I cross the street carefully that I'm going to get hit by a car, and the benefits, getting where you want to go, outweigh that risk, right? So we're always doing this kind of consideration. What is the risk? What is the benefit? Okay, I do this thing or don't do it. And it's just the same sort of thing with these privacy considerations, right? Does that make sense?
I'd like to ask, for example, in United States, like for example, if they do surveillance for a national security, then how do we ensure that the organization itself is self-disciplinary to make sure that they are really doing it for national security, but not for other like user surveillance?
Yeah. So in the United States, there are very specific laws about what you can and can't do as a law enforcement agency in terms of surveillance. In recent years, all those restrictions have basically been ignored by governments and the government and by the security agencies. So what to do in that case is hard to say. But the case in Hong Kong is worse because there are very few limits on what law enforcement, or individuals in fact, can do, right? So basically you can be a law enforcement agent can monitor your email, your chats, your web browsing, etc., without even getting any prior permission to do so, even within the police department, right? So that's a bad situation that really needs to be changed, I think, in the law. I mean, what to do about the NSA, who at this point seem to be sort of a rogue agency doing whatever they want within the U.S., but also outside the U.S., right? That's a very difficult question. You know, one way is through technical mechanisms. If we can encrypt everything, then they won't be able to read those things. But there's, you know, the NSA is so powerful and has so many resources that if they target you, they're basically going to get whatever information they want, you know. But there's still the case of sort of mass surveillance, like surveilling all email as it goes through the networks, that we want to make very difficult, right? We want to make it impossible for them to do that, and that's a reasonable goal, I think. You know, if they target you as one person that they want to get, they're probably going to get you. Okay, thanks so much for listening.